The New Garden is a podcast on technological power, promise, and peril. Technology is no longer just a set of tools. It's a force that shapes our desires, our communities, and even our theology. The New Garden explores what it means to live faithfully at a time when humanity can rewrite genomes, simulate consciousness, and manufacture joy with the push of a button. Drawing from Christian tradition and moral imagination, the podcast confronts the tension between what is possible and what might undo us. Each episode is a guided reflection on our age of godlike power, an invitation to discern how we cultivate this new garden without becoming the serpent in it.
Oh, here we go. We're starting the New Garden podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks to First Pres for commissioning this and kicking it off.
Yeah, I think it's so important that there's a conversation like this because so many people of faith, so many Christians that we're connecting to are really trying to think theologically about technology. Oftentimes, the first encounter is one of fear, and then there's a sense of I want to understand how technology impacts my faith, how it shapes my faith, how it shapes me as a human being. Does it create good? Does it create evil? Does it create ambivalence in my life? And I'm really encouraged because people are wanting to have this conversation. So I'm glad we get to have it together and get to have it with a ton of incredible guests in the coming weeks.
Me too. And this is the issue of our time. Mm-hmm. And it's like the fish who's swimming along and then somebody else says, how's the water? And the fish says, what's water? It's like technology is all around us. It's ubiquitous. It's going to continue advancing at a rate that us even 5-10 years ago can't imagine and can't fathom. And every time we get distracted by something crazy that's happening in the political world right now, or the markets, or in popular culture, and a week or two goes by, I come back to the next piece of news around a technology advancement. And it's like a reminder that the world is changing at a rapid and unprecedented rate. And so that question around what is it going to do to us as individuals and as a church and our institutions? Like, if we're not asking that and things are just happening automatically, like we risk getting to a place where we don't want to go. Yeah. And I think the opposite of that is totally true too. With the right amount of intention and focus and hope and imagination, we can use these tools to get to just a blessed and holy place. Yeah. And so I'm glad that there is a space for us asking those questions and shining a light on it, and appreciate you all setting this up.
Well, and as we get started into this conversation, this multi-week, multi-month conversation, I think it's important to let everybody who's tuning in, watching, listening, that we are taking a very positive approach, not with sort of a naivete, but we see the possibilities of and the potential of technology as it relates to the growth of our faith, our understanding of what it means to be human, even how we love one another, and from the Christian perspective as Christ has loved us. And so it's not going to be where we're just blindly aligned to every new technology, every new efficiency, every new thing that comes out. We just nod our heads and say, yes, yes, yes. But we want to come to this conversation and want this podcast to really have open hands to the potential and possibility of what technology can do for our life of faith, our way of being human together, and really have a thoughtful, discerning eye towards the emerging technology. Because you're right, Brent, like the rapidness of technological change, and at some level, it's been like that for a little while, but we're going to constantly have to reimagine and reframe these conversations. I do think it's what you said earlier. It's kind of stuck with me, and I want to reflect on it for just a second. But particularly now, with just the heightened political angst and anxieties that we have, those things will fade. They're gonna pass as elections happen, as changes happen, as policies morph and change. But this technological arc is really consistent. And I think we need to pay more attention to that in some ways than just some of the political banter and what's covered on the major news networks or online networks that we see.
Yeah, and it is tough because that's what you're being served. That might be what's coming your way in the algorithm. But I have little girls and a recent son as well, and they're going to have to navigate decisions about what computers they put in their brains. And we're just talking about a different level of decision making and power that's coming with these technologies now. And I'm grateful that we're taking the optimistic and discerning framework around the technologies. And I always come back to the hammer example. Like, the hammer itself is not good or it's not bad. It's a hammer, it's a tool. But that same hammer that can put a nail in a Habitat for Humanity house and build something new can break your car window or your skull.
Yeah.
And it's how a tool is wielded. And we don't just have hammers, we have these super technologies and these super tools that have the ability to change how we're formed as people and Christians and how we live and how we die. And that's accelerating at a rate that it just deserves such a long.
Yeah. And we are tool makers. I mean, I think that's like the very essence of our first call. If you go to the garden story in Genesis, to be fruitful and multiply, to steward the earth, to care for the earth. And you can care for the earth with your hands, but our creative God created us as creative beings, and we make tools. And those tools can be used for good or for ill. And you can just trace the arc of human history and see how certain tools that may have been designed for good are now being used for evil. And the same is true. The same litmus test, I think, needs to be applied to AI and to bioengineering. We need to be able to say, does this create good or does this create evil? Does this create human flourishing, or does it demoralize or diminish the image of God in the other? And I hope we get into that as we get these guests on our show and really push them to answer those questions theologically and thoughtfully for our time and our place.
Yeah, was there curious if you personally had either an aha moment or some point where you knew this elevated to a topic that you really wanted to focus on personally for First Pres to do this podcast? Did you have a moment where either the light came on or something clicked as it relates to technology?
Yeah, I will say, like, there was this singular moment that happened that sort of was and it was really mundane, and it was really common. And it was an older member of our church who came up to me and was basically lamenting, not complaining, but lamenting how difficult it is for her to navigate our baseline technologies of, like, QR codes to check in, our database, how to maintain the membership of, the membership records by yourself, self-run in our database. Conversations about online giving, like that kind of thing. And it was very common. It was very, like, sort of your typical, what I felt was like a generational thing, like somebody who's trying to engage these new technologies and these new platforms that are ubiquitous now. Like, they're pretty straightforward. But what it was doing to her, like how she was articulating her feelings of being, like, left behind rather, of feeling like incompetent or impotent to participate in this. I was like, whoa, like, this is doing something to her, like our invitation. And so I just thought, okay, if that's true in this, like, very common, very, like, sort of base level, foundational level, like, I mean, maybe back in the day when folks were just learning how to get on email and they're like, how does this work, right? Like, now it's just like everybody knows how to email, right? Mostly everybody knows how to email. Like, I feel like, what about AI? What about bioengineering? What about biotech? What about CRISPR technologies, right? Like, what about autonomous driving cars? Like if our platforms were causing this anxiety and dissonance in this person, what is all of this future technology, current technology going to do in her soul? Right. And that sort of opened the door. And what I did then was I did a sermon series in June of 2023 around some of these questions that really have shaped, I think, the trajectory of where we're headed. And I've realized too that every sermon I'm preaching now, it's not just like hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, like Karl Barth once said. Like it's important. It's like holding the Bible in one hand and holding sort of Silicon Valley in the other. That we have to be talking about what these technologies do to our souls, what they do to our faith, what they do to our bodies, what they do to our minds, and whether or not we want to encourage that or not encourage that. So that was the impetus. What it was doing to her spirit was like, wait a minute, we need to talk about this.
Yeah. And obviously I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Tony Sundermeier, and I'm just a guy.
Not true.
Maybe true. I'm a small business owner. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a dad of 3 little kids who are wonderful, and I care about the next generation. And then I'm also a Christian, and this story was part of my faith journey personally. And at the time I was working for Uber, I was in my mid-20s, I was living fast in kind of that spiritual, I know something's over there, but I'm relatively agnostic and undefined, maybe a little disillusioned with the Christianity that I saw in my youth and maybe haven't seen really put into practice in the way that we live in modern 21st century Western capitalist America. And so I knew there was something out there, but I hadn't defined what it meant in my heart. Mm-hmm. And then I was reading Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near. And that was the first time when I really started thinking about, what's going to happen long term if we play this out over decades, and do I care?
Yeah.
And, I was imagining a world in which automation really changes the nature of the economy. Maybe we don't need a large part of the workforce in the way that we've relied on population growth to sustain us in the past. Suppose there's kind of a violent uprising where some people have and some people don't have, and we have a coming apart. Do I care? Does that matter? Mm-hmm. And I felt an absolute yes at a soul level. Mm-hmm. And, in retrospect, I would say that was God tapping on me to say there's clearly something there. And, we're 10 years on, and I've been asking those questions around where are we going, and why? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for my family? What does it mean for the world that we want to see created? And so I listened to Tony's sermon series that he alluded to in 2023, and then I have a podcast that I've hosted where I basically ask folks, how do we want to live well in this super technology era? What is it that we want to do? And I've interviewed people in Atlanta, and so Tony and I did an episode on faith and technology, and it was one where we maybe recorded for 90 minutes and could have gone for 9 hours. And so that was a little over a year ago. And then since then, this topic has just been germane, and we've been thinking about how we could continue to move on it. And so that's kind of the genesis in the back.
Yeah, and I think what I appreciate about Brent and our conversations leading up to this, and like our plotting and planning for this podcast, is we're touching on what I think are ancient desires, right? Like desires that religious sociologists can locate culture to culture, generation to generation. Desires of like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does human flourishing look like? This like sort of internal, very evolutionary desire not to die, right? Like to live and to live life, in Jesus' words, to the full. And the way today, and I think this is really important as we launch into this work and this conversation, is the way that technology is seeking to meet these desires that both of us have identified in others and have identified in ourselves. And we've talked a lot about Yuval Noah Harari as kind of a sage of our time, but he talks about like these 3 desires of unending happiness or uninterrupted happiness, uninterrupted joy or pleasure. Like we're pleasure-seeking beings. It talks about the problem of death, which Camus once said is the philosopher's only problem to go unsolved. It really is. And then godlike power, like not just efficiency, but power to overcome illness, sickness, societal problems, etc. And Harari, I think, is a prophet of our time and is saying we are building technologies that are seeking to meet those deep needs in us. And I want to, of course, and I know you want to, like invite the Christian story into those longings. Like, let's name them. Yeah, like I don't want to die. Like I want to live to see my grandkids and great grandkids. I want to experience life. I want to see the Eagles win another Super Bowl, right? Like I want all of those things. But also like the whole notion in the Christian story, like you can't have life without death, right? And so how do we frame that and not just let technology sort of dictate like just without even thinking about it? Well, yeah, I'm just going to upload my brain to a computer and I'll live on forever. I think the transhumanists are speaking into this need as well, and they may go a different direction than we want to go, right? This godlike power. I think we all have power. We need to claim our power. But as I often tell people, if you want to know what, as a Presbyterian, what Presbyterians are all about, God is God, and you're not, and I'm not. So like tempering all of that happiness, the joy, but we also know that suffering and self-sacrifice is a big part of the Christian story. To lose one's life to find it. And so we're bombarded now by these technologies that are seeking to meet those deep needs in us, that like the quest for immortality, the quest for unending happiness, the quest for godlike power. And we need to have a rubric and understanding of how what we're going to say yes to and what we're going to say no to moving forward.
Yeah, and there's just so many fine lines that we're going to have to find and have to navigate. Yeah. And I love the never-ending happiness, godlike power, immortality framework to look at those desires that the market is trying to solve for. Like that's what capitalism is trying to serve you, is moving closer to that. Yeah. And in many ways, that's a great thing that we should celebrate. And then there's also, especially when you introduce super technology, you get to some of these, well, that makes me feel like a little weird and uncomfortable. And, I kind of do it to be deliberately provocative when we are setting up some of these episodes with a guest, but I love asking about the orgasm button. It's like if you can have a brain-computer interface planted in your brain, you can press a button and have a never-ending orgasm. Like, if we can do that, is that going to be how people spend their time? Yeah. And should we celebrate that? Or is that kind of whoa, that just feels like it's taking a physical process, moving into your brain, letting you manipulate it. Then if you end up inside doing that instead of out living your life, like, whoa, that feels wrong. That's not how we're supposed to live. Yeah. And there's 15 offshoots of questions like that are going to become important. And we still have to find a guest to do that episode because no one's like, I have the answer to that question.
This is one of Brent's big ideas is the pleasure button episode, and we have not found somebody to do it yet. But it's true. I mean, it's the same. I mean, it's like Advil. I mean, it's not like Advil, but it's...
Yeah, no one hears the Advil and says, that's off limits.
Exactly.
Whoa.
Exactly. Nobody says ibuprofen. No, let's keep that at bay. And I think that's, I think it also, like, what can science do and biotechnology do in utero? And things that we might say will make someone stronger. If some sort of, like, I'll give an example in my own life. Like, I have dyslexia. Like, if technology could solve for dyslexia in utero, which potentially that's possible, I'm going to be a different person than I am. At the same time, the suffering that I experienced, and I use that word loosely, the frustrations I experienced as a child going undiagnosed with that and not getting the support I needed, is who I am. That's what makes me who I am today. It's part of my charisma. It's part of my personality. It's part of who I am. It's part of what makes me good at some things and not good at other things. If you took that away from me in utero, I'm a different person, right? So I think that's a great question. Like the interventions, we'll talk as we're preparing for this podcast, like the interventions, we say pacemakers are okay, right? Mechanical limbs are okay. Artificial limbs are okay. We talked about, like, I have a friend who has Parkinson's, and he's got one of these brain stimulators that is hooked up inside of his body that if he turns it off, he goes limp. Yeah. Like, we say that's okay.
Yeah. That's an extension of a Jesus miracle,
exactly.
You could say.
Yeah, exactly. We can get into that in this episode for sure. But yeah, we codify that. And we say we put the good seal of approval is what I'm trying to say. We put that seal of approval on it and say that's good. Well, why not these other interventions?
Yeah, and I think parenting is a really helpful lens to ask some of these questions, because it starts really innocently and totally understandably. If you had a parent and they said, "Hey, would you like your kid to be dyslexic or not?"
Yeah.
No parent is going to be like, "Yeah, sign me up for the dyslexia." And so it's like, if it's a no side effect complication and you can turn off dyslexia, then of course you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But then how far are you willing to extrapolate that? If a cell can reprogram, or if a shot can reprogram your cells before you're even born, what about if it's reprogramming memories or your fundamental desires or the way you see and view the world? And how do we decide what's okay for us to proactively manipulate versus what's off limits? And
Right. I mean, you could take it into some of the hot button issues of the day, from race to sexual identity. To gender identity. What if we develop technologies that can manipulate that in utero, one way or another? Like, do we want to do that? Do we want to live in that world? And I think, I've, in my own like sort of science fiction imagination, like I've thought about, like, what would a world look like if everybody did look the same? If we could bioengineer in utero, there'd be like sort of a lag, right? And if we're living forever, there'd be an eternal lag. But what would that look like? Would that end racism, for example? If in utero you could change the skin pigmentation? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think these are some of the questions we have to ask when it comes to technological interventions to quote unquote alleviate suffering, or to set the human being up for a particular way of experiencing the world. And I know we may not see that in our lifetime, we may, but it's coming. It's already here in some ways.
Yeah, I think a fundamental truth about this time in this era is that you can't throw out a hypothetical that's related to technology advancement that's too far-fetched.
Yeah, exactly.
And I read the book One Summer about 1927, and it's Babe Ruth and Al Capone and lots happening, but Charles Lindbergh does the first flight across the Atlantic. And it is like earth-shattering news. 5 million people in New York came out for the ticker tape parade to see him for 2 seconds when he got back from that transatlantic flight. And it was whoosh. Fast forward 100 years, like transatlantic flight, that's nothing.
Right.
And so in our children's lives and their children's lifetimes, things that we can't imagine or fathom right now are going to be ubiquitous and commonplace.
Yeah.
And the truth is, AI is going to sound like an oracle, and we're going to manipulate our bodies and our brains. And we have to decide, is it actually an oracle? Or does it just sound like that? And do we want to change our physiology? Or is that opening a door that we do not want to go down?
Yeah.
And the questions just have so much gravity to them.
Yeah. And I think, like, to frame it theologically, and you alluded to this, and I think it's a good entry point for this conversation, is, I get really hyper-focused when Jesus says to his disciples, "You will do greater things than these," right? And what are the greatest things that Jesus did? Well, he turned water into wine. He took a kid's lunch and fed 5,000 people. He raised Lazarus from the dead. Like, he started the church, right? Like, he started the community of God in the way that we understand it now, as part of the fulfillment of God's covenant to Israel. and like a movement like the world has never seen, and still is alive and well in so many different ways. Other ways it's not, but in so many different ways it is. But what did Jesus mean when he said, "You will do greater things than these"? Is it the invention of the pacemaker? Is it a transatlantic flight? I think so many people, often biblical scholars, pastors, lay people reading that text are like, well, he meant like greater love, like these more like amorphous sort of intangibles. But what if like he really did mean something that's material? The way that water got turned into wine and loaves and fishes turned into a great feast. Like that's material. And so like what if Jesus imagined in the divine mind a pacemaker or an autonomous driving car or an LLM that somebody uses who's got suicidal ideation and uses a chatbot, and the chatbot says, "Hey, call this phone number right away. This prevention hotline right away." I mean, that flourishes life, right? Like that, to me, like I think that's a profound theological question. What did Jesus mean when he said, "We will do greater things"? And maybe we're living it right now. I mean, it's Teilhard, right? Desjardins, who talks about convergence. And for those who don't know, Teilhard, Desjardins, I joked earlier that
The L.
the L, don't pronounce the L in French. Teilhard. I got a C- in French. Thanks, Mrs. Naughton.
No, that's on you. Don't put that on Mrs. Naughton.
You're right. But Teilhard talks about convergence and like all things. He was a scientist, French, in the 20th century, and he talked about how like the unity of God, all of these things converge, and he saw technology and science as a way in which all are coming to what he called the omega point, like to the point of Christ. And this is he really has been influential to Richard Rohr, and I know a lot of our listeners will be familiar with Richard Rohr's name and sort of the universal Christ, all of it coming together. Like, and I think that's what gives us a little bit of optimism, because we could see these technologies, we can see this convergence of it all coming together into reconciliation. You know, one of the highest values of the Christian, of the gospel, right? Reconciliation, human flourishing, communities flourishing, right? Life to the full. Like we can see that convergence. And I don't want to just say that what Jesus was talking about when he was saying, "You'll do greater things," that it was just, "Oh, you'll love in great ways." And I mean that. I know love, you know, what did King say? Justice is what love looks like in public. I'm not talking about it in that way. I'm talking it more about emotional or just sort of abstract. What if it is the actual material that we create, the tools that we create, are helping enter and receive the kingdom of God? Is that possible? Because I'm not satisfied to say Jesus meant something else. I think it is part of this material world.
And that is why the church has to lead on this topic as the agent of meaning making for people in this era.
Yeah.
Because if Jesus has been here since the beginning and all things were created in and through Christ, and Jesus will be here long after you and I, unless we're immortal, then the truth is these tools and technologies will be used for Christ-like purposes, but also we know that without the intention set by organizations like the church, and without a noble purpose and an aspiration to be like Christ, then these tools will just be servants of the market. And the capitalist market and what the market wants is for us to believe that we need something else to be fulfilled and whole and right. And I think there's a risk that if we use the technologies to be in 3 meetings at once and optimizing ourselves to the nth degree and making sure that our children are the perfect, best, optimized versions of themselves so they can outcompete other people's children, that we're just going to spin the hamster wheel faster, and we risk missing the flourishing and the vitality that a tool like this might use if it helps move us towards a more Christ-like viewpoint of the world and form us into true disciples. And so that's, I think, the role of the church, is to how do we keep the main objective and the main goal, and not become just captivated by what these tools will want us to do.
I think that's why I'm not just optimistic about technology, but I'm optimistic about the future. And part of that optimism comes from, for the church, the future of the church, I mean. Part of that optimism comes with, like, we know how to gather. We know how important incarnation and presence is. We know how important the sacraments are, the water, and which represents the earth, right, and the bread that represents the earth. But of course, as Christ's body broken, blood shed for us, that this optimism that I have is that we know how to ask good questions. And in some ways, I think there are congregations, and I'm guilty of this too, that forget how to ask good questions. Meaning-making questions, like you said earlier, purpose, life-flourishing questions, kingdom of God questions. We can get stuck in bureaucracy. We can get stuck in a technocratic mindset. How do we do X? How do we do Y? Et cetera, et cetera. But keeping the main thing, I think is part of our DNA. Who is God? And who is God calling us to be? How are we loving God? How are we loving our neighbor? How are we loving ourselves? And I think that rubric, I think we've got a stake in the future. And we have to, I think this is just my own personal bias, but I think we need to focus more on these conversations, these technological conversations about who are we, who are they making us into, how are we using them, etc., more than what occupies so much of our time, which is the political discourse. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I want to affirm that it matters. Politics matter. Who's in leadership matters. But like I said earlier, I mean, I think, LLMs are going to outlive Joe Biden and Donald Trump, right? I mean, so how are they shaping us? And in so many ways, I think they're doing it subconsciously. So let's bring it out into the light, right? Like, as a church, let's have these conversations so that we can not just be prepared for what's coming, but to live faithfully today.
Yeah. And I think if we do what we are hoping to do with this podcast, we'll kind of play on three levels that will interplay throughout. One is we want to look at some of these big long-term questions. And, we were being deliberately provocative with the pleasure button earlier, but there are questions around things like never-ending happiness and immortality that are big questions that we want to get at. They can also feel a little bit conceptual, theoretical, far off. I think we also want to bring a theological lens. Like, we want to bring this back to the gospel, and the guests that we're going to have on are people of faith, oftentimes in pastoral roles, and so we want to really bring a faith orientation to this conversation. And then the third is, like, we want this to be practical. We want people to have tools for discernment in their own lives, because I think a real truth of this moment is that a lot of things will happen automatically if we don't even realize it. And another one of these examples of wherein this technological advancement became really true in my life, I was teaching my daughter how to ride a bike, and she was fearful to go from the balance bike to the pedal bike. And I had tried my tricks, and then I brought out ChatGPT, the audio version, and I was like, hey, Chat, can you give my daughter a few tips on riding her first pedal bike? And we're in Piedmont Park. And so she talks to ChatGPT, and it gives her basically some tactical things and then a pep talk. And they're like, all right, you got this. And Nell says, all right, thanks. I love you. And says, I love you to ChatGPT. And of course, she kind of said that because she's used to ending phone calls with I love you. Yeah. But also I was like, oh, does she love ChatGPT? And then gradually I'm thinking about, man, what about when she's got a never fatiguing thought partner who knows her preferences, who's understanding, who wants to hear her side, who will talk to her forever? Like, do I risk, is her best friend going to be an AI that's a doll that will talk to her forever? Do I risk ceding my role as guide and caretaker and parent? Will that happen if I'm not careful and I let, she asked me 12 questions about why is Ronald Acuna's ACL torn? What's a torn ACL? Did he slide into the base? Like, when's he back? Why is he not back yet? And by the end, I was like, I just don't know. But ChatGPT will never get tired of answering those questions. And so if we cede things to the algorithms, we might not realize we're seeding them there, but there are going to be these practical application points where we're just going to use more and more of it. And we just have to not do that unconsciously. So anyway, to wrap that up, I think we want to ask the big questions. We want to bring a theological lens. And also we want to say, hey, you're a parent, you're a coworker, you're a child, you're going to church, you're trying to do your best out here. It's tough. We all feel like we're on the back of the treadmill and at risk of falling off. Like, how do you bring this together and orient towards it? So we're hoping to give folks those tools. So as we think about how the church should orient towards these technologies in this emerging area and how we should as individuals, can you offer kind of a theological framing that grounds us in what to look for in emerging technology?
I think for me there's two like biblical pericopes that I hold up and I think about. The first is in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, right? The tower is a piece of technology, right? And there's a lot of theological angles, a lot of scholarly angles you can take on this. But for our purposes here, what I'm thinking about is the way that God intervenes and says, if they do this, nothing will be impossible for them, right? In other words, they will become godlike, right? They will have power. So it's clear in the Hebrew, nothing will be impossible for them. And it's viewed pejoratively. Fast forward to Jesus' ministry, and he says to his disciples, nothing will be impossible for you. Like, that's a positive attribution. Jesus is saying, like we talked about in other contexts, he's saying you're going to do greater things. Nothing's going to be impossible for you in the positive sense. And so when we're discerning this convergence of technology and human life and all this, I think we have to hold Babel on one pole, and we have to hold Jesus's words to his followers that nothing will be impossible for you. That positive side, like there's optimism, there's good that's coming, but also the Babel side where we replace God, or we become God, or we think we're God. And so when we're approaching these technologies, we're using this framework of, and we say it in our introduction, of both promise and peril. There's both promise and peril. And I think it'd be good, like, if we share with our listeners and our viewers, if we did a little bit of like sort of 30,000 foot, like when we say emerging technologies, or when we talk about technology, like what are we actually thinking about when we talk about that? And I think that'd be probably helpful if you dive into that.
I can run us through, let's call it like 4 buckets of emerging technology, and I'll get a little promise and peril in for each of those. I think the first is the redesign of the human. And so genetic, neural, behavioral technologies that give us tools not only to heal, but to modify, optimize, and reprogram ourselves, whether that's genetic engineering, wearable technologies, CRISPR, brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, we'll discuss frequently. And I think the promise of the redesigning of the human is healing. It's restoration. It's the continuance of our bodies. It's the elimination of disease. And then the peril is almost a world where weakness is intolerable, or we're edited out, and where the gifted are designed rather than imbued, where the soul gets edited out of the equation or marginalized. And I can hold both of those. And then I think we're talking about tools that will supercharge markets and economic reformation. And so AI and automation that enable markets to think, adapt, and act faster than most human institutions, including the church.
Yeah.
So that's a question. And the promise of that is new forms of productivity and equity in the accomplishing of mission.
Yeah.
The peril of that might be joblessness or moral drift or institutions that change faster than our human adaptation can keep up with. I think the end of shared reality in a hyper-personalized economy with AI-driven algorithmic feeds and otherwise, where you're literally fed different information to consume than I am, and maybe the way that we see the world literally starts to look different because we are given different information. That might look like surveillance capitalism, that might look like deep fakes, algorithmic news feeds that could have an implication that no one sees the world anymore. And again, there's promise there, the access to infinite wisdom and information personalized in a way that's going to help you on your unique development journey and according to your likes and dislikes. I think the perils are a little bit more obvious for that one. So fragmentation, isolation, distrust, loss of shared meaning. And then the last one, we've mentioned some of this, but radical agency over life, death, and meaning. And I think this one is a little bit different than just the redesign of the human that we mentioned earlier. But this is things like biotechnology, robotics, digital selves giving us control over pain, aging, identity, and morality, where we might extend our life radically and heal traumas and memories that are adverse, like we talked about earlier. But the peril is if we lose the we lose the wisdom of limits and binding our ambitions, the soul and the pursuit of engineered transcendence. Like if we are moving those things away from something that's God-given to something that we engineer. And so those are some of the technologies. Like it's not just AI, it's not just LLMs, but it's what we're going to do to our bodies and what we're going to do to our brains and what it changes in the ways that we consume information and disseminate it and share it as institutions.
Yeah, as we've said, and we want to keep pressing this, is that we want to hold sort of open hands, open hearts, open minds to this technology as being part of what God does to redeem the world. Could CRISPR, could brain interfaces be part of what it means to enter and receive the kingdom of God? We're also not naive. We both come from traditions that are fully honest about human depravity and human corruption. So we're not naive to think that these technologies couldn't be used for evil or for control or for ending democracy or any one of these things. So holding that space for promise and peril is really important for this endeavor, for our conversations with everybody that we're going to talk to. We want to make sure that they know that we want to create that space, because so much of, at least in my pastoral ministry, there's so much fear and so much anxiety, where there needs to be that framing that there is possible good and already realized good that's coming out of our technologies, just as much as we see, you mentioned deep fakes, the way that even like across social media, especially the way misinformation is communicated, it's to control or to sell, to make rich, or to mislead, to get off track. So we've talked a little bit about like what kind of rubric would we want to create, and just some of the questions. This isn't just this is an evolving kind of way of inquiry, right? Like, does this technology cultivate or diminish my capacity for presence? For what does it mean to be human, right? Or does it reinforce or undermine the imago Dei, the image of God, that all of us are created in the image of God? Does it undermine, the technology does it undermine my image? Does it undermine my neighbor's image? Does it create community, or does it create distance or fragmentation? So I think like the most important question that we can ask, and anybody can ask this question, and I think we should ask this question, Christians, human beings, all of us, does this technology create a vice or does it create virtue? And as you said earlier, with hammers and nails, a hammer can be used to build a habitat house. It could be used as a weapon. Technologies, these tools can be used to create virtue in us, through us, can also be used to create vice.
Absolutely. And I think this matters. These questions matter for us to ask as parents. They matter as we think about vocation and what is our work to do. It matters at a soul level. What am I being formed into? I love the word formation. And these tools are going to be ultimate tools of formation. And they certainly matter for the future of the church. What do we need at an institutional, societal level? How do we need the church to act for us as individuals as well? What should the church become? And we think about the arc of creation, distortion, and redemption. And it's a biblical arc that we're going to take for many of these episodes where, creation, what is the state of things? We talked about Imago Dei. What are we created to do? What's becoming possible with this technology? This distortion question, how can it be used for sin, if that's a word that resonates, or evil, or disconnecting us from God and our godlike purpose? And I think that's a lot of where the discourse around AI and technology is right now in the media, because a lot of the market and the algorithmic news feeds we've mentioned are based on limbic hijacks where they need to make you feel scared or upset. And so a lot of the conversation that I hear stops at distortion and all of these questions that are meant to make us feel uncomfortable. But we know as Easter people and Christians that there's a redemption arc of the story and restoration. And we want to focus on that too. And that part of the hope that you mentioned earlier, paint us a vision. We want to bring this out in this podcast, a vision for where this can be going, where we get to a place of human flourishing and vitality and families that are healthy and communities that are well and a church that's thriving, where these tools and technologies are correctly oriented in our lives, not running them, but serving us in our pursuit of knowing God and living in a God-like way. And that's what we want to seek and give our listeners the tools for discerning in their own lives so that we get to that good point. And so we'll focus on that redemption story.
So that's where we're headed. It's a big mountain to climb, but it's going to be a great journey. And so for our listeners, as we press on in this first season of the New Garden, we're going to be thinking about what does it mean that we're creating machines in the image of God, especially AI, that we love intelligence, we love quote unquote wisdom. What does it mean that we're creating programs and robots and have LLMs, large language models, that are made like us, and we're made in God's image? Thinking about, you talked earlier about surveillance capitalism, and the ways in which it creates these algorithms that dictate and shape who we are and the choices that we make. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about like the future of human love and care, when you can have some needs met by a chatbot, but probably, at least not right now, all of your needs. Like, what does it mean to be human, especially as Christians? What does it mean to be incarnational, be present? What does it mean to be embodied? We're going to talk about experience and the end of certain types of experiences. And we're going to talk about hope. We're going to talk about the possibilities of entering and receiving the kingdom of God through emerging technologies. That's possible.
There's the ultimate pleasure button episode 2. We're doing that one. We're going to ask the tough. We're going to ask.
We'll see. We're going to get that one. We'll see. We're going to get that one. But we want all our listeners to subscribe, to like, and also to engage in discourse through the platform that we'll put out there, and that's out there. And we want to be able to integrate some of what you're thinking into the conversations we're going to have. It's going to be a great journey, and we hope you stay with us throughout this first season.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. Thanks, Brent.
Thanks for listening to the New Garden podcast. We look forward to you staying with us over this first season. Please like, subscribe, follow, and also comment in. We're already learning so much through the preparation and doing these episodes, and we look forward to learning alongside you all. So thank you for journeying with us, and we'll see you on the next episode of the New Garden podcast.
The New Garden is a production of First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. Produced by Tim Haney. Executive producer, Mark Wallace McGuire. Music by Sindhu Geed.
Seeing eyes swallowed by their pride. Night is taken, day is taken. Where's your God? Says your God. Only picture perfect latitudes thrown around. Holding fast when everyone's gone. Can't you see?